I first met Muriel Spark in 1977 when I became her American publisher. This is something that I'd been trying to arrange for many years. In those days, a long time ago now, most publishing business was conducted over lunch, usually long lunches in French midtown restaurants. And sure, regular as clockwork, every few months I would have lunch, a long lunch, with Muriel's agent, a wonderful grande dame called Dorothy Olding, and we'd begin the same way. I'd say, is Muriel happy? This wasn't an idle question. Muriel had been unhappy before in the past, and she had in fact switched publishers, so I wasn't just fishing. I thought, who knew? And I had always wanted to publish her. She was one of the kind of author for whom I had got into the business in the first place. I knew that there were rumors of difficulties, that she had had rows with publishers, but I liked the work, and besides, who wasn't difficult when you come right down to it? One day I got a call from Dorothy who said, well, honey, this is your chance, but you're going to have to pay for it. So I said, okay, how much? And we got into a bidding war because other people wanted to publish Muriel. I would love to say that she came to me because she admired my editorial acumen, but in fact, I was the high bid. And it made for a great literary incentive, and so we became author and publisher. My colleague and I thought, well, what have I done? And my colleague at the time said, fasten your seatbelt. It never happened. She was fun to be with, she was a delight to work with, she was a professional. If she thought that you knew what you were doing, she let you do it. It was a relationship that lasted, our professional relationship lasted for nearly 20 years and included many books. And after I left publishing to become a writer, we stayed friends for the rest of her life. Why it should have worked out this way is something that I've often thought about. And I think it's not because we had such great publishing successes together, although we did very well, but in the way of these things, some books did better than others. But I think it was more that we got on. We got the same jokes. We often noticed the same things. Muriel, was a world-class noticer. Nothing missed her. And every once in a while, she would catch your eye because you would notice the same thing, and a little conspiratorial smile would go between you. Like, oh, you heard that, did you? She delighted in quirky behavior and was always alert to it. I think I was also lucky in the sense that I had met her at the happiest time of her life. All of the early struggles for financial security, for literary reputation, all of these battles had been won. She was secure, her reputation was certainly unassailable, she was world famous, she had made it. She had become the writer that she always hoped she would be. Plus, at this point, Penelope Jardine had entered her life, first as an assistant and then as her lifelong companion and great friend, and really Rock of Gibraltar. And she offered Muriel what Muriel had always wanted, which was the time and space to write. The space was a writing studio in Penelope's house in Tuscany. The time came because she would shoo away all of the distractions. The distractions, by the way, very much included American publishers on the phone. So Penelope and I would often do the business. And it was what Muriel had always been after, just the ability to do this writing. I think finally, what drew us together and kept us together was that she instinctively knew, or later learned, that I valued the work, that the work was important, that I cared about it. And she, I think early on, decided that she could trust me with the caretaking of the work. Nothing was more important to her. There was a biography written, and the biographer came to interview me and said, can you have one word that's Muriel? And I said, well, no, there's not one word that's anybody. He said, well, the key. What's the key to Muriel? And I thought, oh, well, this is the Citizen Kane School of Biography. We're going to have Rosebud, and there's going to be one image or one traumatic childhood event that sort of defines the person. And I said, no, it's, she's more complicated. Everybody's more complicated than that. There isn't a key. I think now what I should have said to him is that the key to understanding, if not everything, at least quite a lot, was her determination to be a writer. to be the person that she always thought she could be. I think it answers so much that happened in her life. I think anybody and anything that thwarted this, that came in the way of it, became an obstacle to be dealt with. And anybody or anything that facilitated this, that aided and abetted, as one of the titles goes, was embraced. I aided and abetted, I was embraced. I was very lucky, and it was a great relationship. The book I want to read the opening of, Loitering with Intent, is one of my favorite of the books that we did together. And I think I've chosen it because I think it's also, in some ways, the most autobiographical of all of Muriel's works. Not just in the sense that there are details and scenes that may have actually been inspired by things in her own life, but because it's about what she truly cared about, which is the writing of fiction. The novel is about a young, struggling novelist in mid-century London who encounters a madcap, sort of eccentric group on the literary fringe. And if you want to see Muriel in that part, I don't think anybody's going to quarrel with you. But be very careful, because as usual in a Spark novel, a lot of games are played with the facts. Let me start with just the opening. Muriel once said that novels were really extended poems, and I think you will hear the careful language, the sense of rhythm, pacing, etc. But there's so much more. What I'd love you to just think about as you listen to this is how much she's packing in to just a few pages. One day in the middle of the 20th century, I sat in an old graveyard which had not yet been demolished in the Kensington area of London, when a young policeman stepped off the path and came over to me. He was shy and smiling. He might have been coming over the grass to ask me for a game of tennis. He only wanted to know what I was doing, but plainly he didn't like to ask. I told him I was writing a poem and offered him a sandwich, which he refused as he had just had his dinner himself. He stopped to talk a while, then he said goodbye, the graves must be very old, and that he wished me good luck and that it was nice to speak to somebody. This was the last day of a whole chunk of my life, but I didn't know that at the time. I sat on the stone slab of some Victorian grave writing my poem as long as the sun lasted. I lived nearby in a bed-sitting room with a gas fire and a gas ring operated by pre-decimal pennies and shillings in the slot, whichever you preferred or had. My morale was high. I needed a job, but that, which should have been a depressing factor when looked at and viewed in cold blood, in fact simply was not. Neither was the swinishness of my landlord, Mr. Alexander, short of stature. I was reluctant to go home lest he should waylay me. I owed him no rent, but he kept insisting that I should take a larger and more expensive room in his house, seeing that I had overcrowded this small single room with my books, my papers, my boxes and bags, my food stores, and evidence of visitors who stayed to tea or came late. So far, I had stood up to the landlord's claim that I was virtually living a double-room life for single-room pay. At the time, I was fascinated by his swinishness. Tall Mrs. Alexander, always kept in the background so far as the renting of rooms was concerned, determined not to be confused with a landlady. Her hair was always glossy black, new from the hairdresser, her nails polished red. She stepped in and out of the house with a polite nod, like another but more superior tenant. I fairly drank her in with my mind while smiling politely back. I had nothing whatsoever against these Alexanders, except in the matter of their wanting me to take on a higher-priced room. If he had thrown me out, I would still have had nothing much against them. I would mainly have been fascinated. In a sense, I felt that the swine Alexander was quite excellent as such, surpassingly hand-picked. And although I wanted to avoid him on my return to my lodging, I knew very well I had something to gain from a confrontation, should it happen. In fact, I was aware of a demon inside me that rejoiced in seeing people as they were, and not only that, but more than ever as they were, and more and more. At that time, I had a number of marvelous friends, full of good and evil. I was close on penniless, but my spirits were all the more high because I had recently escaped from the Autobiographical Association, where I was thought rather mad, if not evil. I'll tell you about the Autobiographical Association. 10 months before the day I had a conversation with the shy policeman, Dear Fleur, came the letter. Dear Fleur. Fleur was the name hazardously bestowed at birth, as always in these cases, before they know what you are going to turn out like. Not that I looked too bad. It was only that Fleur wasn't the right name, and yet it was mine, as are the names of those melancholy joys, those timid victors, the inglorious Glorias and materialistic Angelas one is bound to meet in the course of a long life of change and infiltration. And I once met a Lancelot who I assure you had nothing to do with chivalry. However all that may be, dear Fleur, went the letter, I think I found a job for you. The letter went on, very boring. It was a well-wishing friend, and I have forgotten what she looked like. Why did I keep these letters? Why? They're all neatly bundled up in thin folders, tied with pink tape, 1949, 1950, 1951, and on and on. I was trained to be a secretary. Maybe I felt that letters ought to be filed, and I'm sure I thought they would be interesting one day. In fact, they aren't very interesting in themselves. For example, about this time, just before the turn of the half-century, a bookshop wrote to ask for their money or they would take further steps. I owed money to bookshops in those days. Some were more lenient than others. I remember at the time thinking that the letter about the further steps quite funny and worth keeping. Perhaps I wrote and told them that I was quite terrified of their further steps approaching nearer, nearer. Perhaps I didn't actually write this, but only considered doing so. Apparently, I paid them in the end, for the final receipt is there, £5, 8 and 9 . Dear Fleur, I think I found a job for you. I wrote off to the address in Northumberland, setting forth my merits as a secretary. Within a week, I got on a bus to go and be interviewed by my new employer at the Berkeley Hotel. It was 6 p.m. I had allowed for the rush hour and arrived early. He was earlier still. And when I went to the desk to ask for him, he rose from a nearby chair and came over to me. He was slight, nearly tall, with white hair, a thin face with high cheekbones which were pink-flushed, although otherwise his face was pale. His right shoulder seemed to protrude further than the left as it fixed in the position for shaking hands, so that his general look was very slightly askew. He had an air which said, I am distinguished. Name, Sir Quentin Oliver. We sat at the table drinking dry sherry. He said, Fleur Talbot, are you half French? No, Fleur was just a name my mother fancied. Ah, interesting. Well, now, yes, let me explain about the undertaking. The wages he offered were of 1936 vintage, and this was 1949, modern times. But I pushed up the starting price a little and took the job for its promise of a totally new experience. Fleur Talbot, he said, sitting there in the Berkeley. Any connection with the Talbots of Talbot Grange? The Honorable Martin Talbot, know who I mean? I said, no. No relation to them. Of course, there are the Talbots of Finley's refineries, those sugar people. She's a great friend of mine, lovely creature, too good for him, if you ask me. Sir Quentin Oliver's London flat was in Hallam Street, near Portland Place. There I went to my job from 9 a.m. till 5:30 p.m, passing the BBC edifice where I had always hoped to get a job but never succeeded. At Hallam Street every morning, the door would be opened by Mrs. Timms, the housekeeper. The first morning, Sir Quentin introduced her to me as Beryl, Mrs. Timms, which she in a top people's accent corrected to Mrs. Beryl Timms. And while I stood waiting with my coat on, they had an altercation over this, he maintaining politely that before her divorce, she had been Mrs. Thomas Timms, and now she was, to be precise, Beryl, Mrs. Timms, but in no circumstances was Mrs. Beryl Timms accepted usage. Mrs. Timms then announced she could produce her national insurance card, her ration book, and her identity card to prove that her name was Mrs. Beryl Timms. Sir Quentin held that the clerks employed in the ministries which issued these documents were ill-informed. Later, he said he would show her what he meant under correct forms of address in one of his reference books. After that, he turned to me. I hope you're not argumentative, he said. An argumentative woman is like water coming through the roof. It says so in the Holy Scriptures, either Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, I forget which. I hope you don't talk too much. I talk very little, I said, which was true, although I listened a lot, because I had a novel, my first in Larva. I took off my coat and handed it somewhat snootily to the refined Mrs. Timms, who took it away roughly and stalked off, hammering the parquet floor with her heels. As she went, she looked contemptuously at the coat, which was a cheap type known then as utility. Utility was at the time the people's garment, recognizable by the label with its motif of overlapping quarter moons. Many of the rich who could afford to spend clothing coupons on non-utility at Dorville, Jackmore, or Savile Row still chose to buy utility, bestowing upon it, I noticed, the inevitable phrase, perfectly all right. I have always been on the listen-in for those sorts of phrases, but perfectly all right was not what Beryl Timms thought of my coat. I followed Sir Quentin into the library. "Come into my parlor," said the spider to the fly, said Sir Quentin. I acknowledged his witticism with the smug smile, which I felt was part of the job. In the interview at the Berkeley, he had told me the work was to be of a literary nature. We are a group, I may add, of some distinction. Your function will be highly interesting, although, of course, on you will depend the efficiency and typewriting. Oh, I hate the word stenography, so American. And of course, the stationery cupboard is dreadfully untidy at the moment and will need seeing to. You'll have your work cut out, Miss Talbot. I had asked at the end of the interview if I could get some pay at the end of the first week, as I couldn't hold out for a month. He went aloof, a little hurt. Perhaps he suspected that I wanted to put the job on a week's trial. This was partly true, but my need for speedy pay was equally true. He had said, "Oh, well, yes, of course, if it's a case of hardship," as one might say a case of seasickness. In the meantime, I had wondered why he had called the interview at a London hotel instead of at the flat where I was to work. Now that I was actually in the flat, he answered that question himself. "It isn't everybody, Miss Talbot, whom I invite to enter my home." I replied agreeably that we all felt like that, and I cast my eyes around the room. I couldn't see the books, they were all behind glass. But Sir Quentin was not satisfied with "we all feel like that." It put us on an equal footing. He said about making plain that I had missed the point. "What I mean," he said, "is that here we have formed a very special circle for a very delicate purpose. The work is top secret. I want you to remember that. I interviewed 6 young ladies, and I have chosen you, Miss Talbot. I want you to remember that." By this time, he was seated at his very splendid desk, leaning back in his chair, eyes half closed, with his hands held before him at chest level, the fingertips of each hand touching the other. I sat at the opposite side of the desk. He waved toward a large antique cabinet. "In there," he said, "are secrets." I wasn't alarmed, for although he was plainly some sort of crank, and it struck me, of course, that he might be up to no good, there was nothing in his voice or manner that I felt as an immediate personal menace. But I was on the alert, in fact excited. The novel I was writing, my first, War Under Chase, was really fulfilling my whole life at that time. I was finding it extraordinary how throughout all the period I had been working on the novel, right from chapter 1, characters and situations, images and phrases that I absolutely needed for the book simply appeared as if from nowhere into my range of perception. I was a magnet for experiences that I needed. Not that I reproduced them photographically and literally. I didn't think for a moment of portraying Sir Quentin as he was. What gave me great happiness was his gift to me of the fingertips of his hands touching each other, and nestling among the words as he waved toward the cabinet in There Are Secrets, the pulsating notion of how much he wanted to impress, how greatly he desired to believe in himself. And I might have left the job there and then and never seen or thought of him again, but carried away with me these 2 items and more. I felt like the walnut cabinet itself towards which he was waving. "In here are secrets," said my mind. At the same time, I gave him my total attention. After all these years, I've got used to this process of artistic apprehension in the normal course of the day, but it was fairly new to me then. Mrs. Timms had also excited me in the same way, an awful woman, but to me, beautifully awful. I must say that in September of '49, I had no idea at all if I could bring off War Under Chase, but whether I was capable of finishing the whole book or not, the excitement was the same. Sir Quentin went on to tell me what the job was about. Mrs. Timms brought in the post, then went to the window and said, "They're dead." She was referring to a bowl of roses which had shed their petals on the table. She gathered up the petals and stuck them in the rose bowl, then lifted the bowl to carry it away. As she did so, she looked at me and caught me watching her. I continued to watch the spot where she had been as if in glazed-eyed abstraction, and perhaps thus I succeeded in fooling her that I hadn't been consciously watching her at all, only looking at the spot where she stood, my thoughts on something else. Perhaps I didn't fool her. One never knows about these things. She continued to grumble about the dead roses till she left the room, looking all the more like the wife of a man I knew in my book. Mrs. Timms even walked like her. I turned my attention to Sir Quentin, who waited for his housekeeper's exit with his eyes half shut and his hands in an attitude almost of prayer, his elbows on the armrests of his chair, his fingertips touching. Human nature, said Sir Quentin, is quite an extraordinary thing. I find it quite extraordinary. You know the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction? I said, yes. It was a dry, rainy, sunny day of September 49. I remember looking towards the window where intermittent sunlight fingered the muslin curtains. My ears have good memory. If I recall certain encounters of the past at all, or am reminded perhaps by old letters that they happened, back come flooding the oral images, and first, and the visual second. So I remember Sir Quentin's way of speech, his words precisely, and his intonation as he said to me, Miss Talbot, are you interested in what I'm saying? Oh, yes, yes, I agree that truth is stranger than fiction. I had thought his eyes were too shut in on his thoughts to notice my head turning towards the window. I know that I had looked away to register within myself some instinctive thoughts. I have a number of friends, he said, and waited for this to sink in. Dutifully now, I kept my eyes on his words. Very important friends, VIPs. We form an association. Do you know anything about the British laws of libel? My dear Miss Talbot, these laws are very narrow and very severe. One may not, for instance, impugn a lady's honor, not that one would wish to, were she in fact a lady. And as for stating the actual truth about one's life, which naturally involves living people, well, it's quite impossible. Do you know what we have done, we who have lived extraordinary, and I mean extraordinary lives? Do you know what we have done about placing the facts on record for posterity? I said, no. We have formed an autobiographical association. We have all started to write our memoirs, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and we are lodging them for 70 years in a safe place until all the living people mentioned therein shall be living no longer. He pointed to the handsome cabinet faintly lit by the sun filtering through the gathered muslin curtains. I longed to be outside walking in the park and chewing over Sir Quentin's character in my mind before even finding out any more about him. Documents of that sort should go into a bank vault, I said. Good, said Sir Quentin in a bored way. You're quite right. That is possibly the ultimate destination of our biographical reminiscences, but that is looking ahead. Now I have to tell you that my friends are largely accustomed to literary composition. I, who have a natural bent in that field, have taken on the direction of the endeavor. They are, of course, men and women of great distinction, living full, very full lives, one way or another these days of change and post-war. One can't expect. Well, the thing is, I'm helping them to write their memoirs, which they haven't time to do. We have friendly meetings, gatherings, get-togethers, and so on. When we are better organized, we shall meet at my property in Northumberland. Those were his words, and I enjoyed them. I thought them over as I walked home through the park. They had already become part of my memoirs. She learns that he is a ferocious snob, a hilarious one, and she meets his mother, who also thinks he's a snob, and when he's being very much a snob, is incontinent at will. If she disapproves of anything he's saying, she simply pees on the floor. But I just wanted this final paragraph about the job. Going home at 6 o'clock in the golden dusk of that lovely autumn, I would walk to Oxford Street, take a bus to Speaker's Corner at Hyde Park, then cross the park to Queensgate. I was fascinated by the strangeness of the job. I made no notes at all, but most nights I would work on my novel, and the ideas of the day would reassemble themselves to form those two female characters which I created in Warrender Chase. Charlotte and Prudence. Not that Charlotte was entirely based on Beryl Timms, not by a long way, nor was my ancient Prudence anything like a replica of Sir Quentin's mummy. The process by which I created my characters was instinctive, the sum of my whole experience of others and of my own potential self, and so it always has been. Sometimes I don't actually meet a character I have created in a novel until some time after the novel has been written and published. And as for my character Warrender Chase himself, I had already outlined and fixed long before I saw Sir Quentin. Now that I come to write this section of my autobiography, I remember vividly in those days when I was writing Warrender Chase without any great hope of getting it published, but with only the excited compulsion to write it, how I walked home across the park one evening, thinking hard about my novel and Beryl Timms as a type, and I stopped in the middle of the pathway. People pass me both ways, going home from their daily work like myself. Whatever I had been specifically thinking about the typology of Mrs. Timms went completely out of my mind. People passed me as I stood, young men with dark suits and girls wearing hats and tailored-looking coats. The thought came to me in a most articulate way. How wonderful it feels to be an artist and a woman in the 20th century. That I was a woman and living in the 20th century were plain facts. That I was an artist was a conviction so strong that I never thought of doubting it then or since. And so, as I stood on the pathway in Hyde Park in that September of 1949, there were as good as 3 facts converging quite miraculously upon myself, and I went on my way rejoicing. That is the Muriel Spark that I knew, blithe but sharp-eyed, serious but also witty. And I suppose what I should have said to that biographer is, if you really want one word, the word is artist. But artist as Fleur Talbot described it in one line a few pages further into the book. When people say that nothing happens in their lives, I believe them. But you must understand that everything happens to an artist. Time is always redeemed, nothing is lost, and wonders never cease. Muriel Spark.
Good evening. My name is Rivka Galhen. I'm a big fan of Muriel's work, but I also teach it almost every semester. And one thing that comes up again and again when you teach it is she can have a really big cast and cover many years, and somehow the novel is 170 pages. And so I was thinking, okay, well, how can I succinctly tell you something about my own admiration for Muriel Spark? And I'll just say that I named my daughter Georgie Spark O'Neill, so there you go. I was going to read from the opening of The Girls of Slender Means, which will speak for itself. Long ago, in 1945, all the nice people in England were poor, allowing for exceptions. The streets of the cities were lined with buildings in bad repair or in no repair at all, bomb sites piled with stony rubble, houses like giant teeth in which decay had been drilled out, leaving only the cavity. Some bomb-ripped buildings looked like the ruins of ancient castles until, at a closer view, the wallpapers of various quite normal rooms would be visible, room above room, exposed as on a stage, with one wall missing. Sometimes a lavatory chain would dangle over nothing from a 4th or 5th floor ceiling. Most of all, the staircases survived, like a new art form leading up and up to an unspecified destination that made unusual demands on the mind's eye. All the nice people were poor. At least that was a general axiom, the best of the rich being poor in spirit. There was absolutely no point in feeling depressed about the scene. It would have been like feeling depressed about the Grand Canyon or some event of the earth outside everyone's scope. People continued to exchange assurances of depressed feelings about the weather or the news or the Albert Memorial, which had not been hit, not even shaken by any bomb from first to last. The May of Tech Club stood obliquely opposite the site of the memorial, in one of a row of tall houses which had endured, but barely. Some bombs had dropped nearby, and in a few back gardens, leaving the buildings cracked on the outside and shakily hinged within, but habitable for the time being. The shattered windows had been replaced with new glass ceilings and loose frames. More recently, the bituminous blackout paint had been removed from landing and bathroom windows. Windows were important in that year of final reckoning. They told at a glance whether a house was inhabited or not. And in the course of the past years, they had accumulated much meaning, having been the main danger zone between domestic life and the war going on outside. Everyone had said when the siren sounded, "Mind the windows. Keep away from the windows. Watch out for the glass." The May of Tech Club had been 3 times window shattered since 1940, but never directly hit. There, the windows of the upper bedrooms overlooked the dip and rise of treetops in Kensington Gardens across the street, with the Albert Memorial to be seen by means of a slight craning and a twist of the neck. These upper bedrooms looked down on the opposite pavement on the park side of the street, and on the tiny people who moved along in neat-looking singles and couples, pushing little prams loaded with pinhead babies and provisions, or carrying little dots of shopping bags. Everyone carried a shopping bag, in case they should be lucky enough to pass a shop that had a sudden stock of something off the rations. From the lower floor dormitories, the people in the street looked larger, and the paths of the park were visible. All the nice people were poor, and few were nicer, as nice people come, than these girls at Kensington, who glanced out of the windows in the early mornings to see what the day looked like, or gazed out on the green summer evenings as if reflecting on the months ahead, on love and the relations of love. Their eyes gave out an eager, spirited light that resembled near genius, but was just youth. The first of the rules of Constitution, drawn up at some remote and innocent Edwardian date, still applied more or less to them. The May of Tech Club exists for the pecuniary convenience and social protection of ladies of slender means below the age of 30 years, who are obliged to reside apart from their families in order to follow an occupation in London. As they realized themselves in varying degrees, few people alive at that time were more delightful, more ingenious, more movingly lovely, and, as it might happen, more savage than the girls of slender means. "I've got something to tell you," said Jane Wright, the woman columnist. At the other end of the telephone, the voice of Dorothy Markham, owner of the flourishing model agency, said, "Darling, where have you been?" She spoke by habit since her debutante days with the utmost enthusiasm of tone. "I've got something to tell you. Do you remember Nicholas Farrington? Remember he used to come to the old May of Tech just after the war? He was an anarchist and a poet sort of thing. A tall man, with the one that got on the roof to sleep out with Selina." "Yes, Nicholas Farrington." "Oh, rather. Has he turned up?" "No, he's been martyred." "Whatted?" "Martyred in Haiti, killed. Remember, he became a brother." "But I've just been to Tahiti. It's marvelous. Everyone's marvelous." "Where did you hear it?" "Haiti. There's a news paragraph just come over Reuters. I'm sure it's terrible the meaning these things accumulate over time. I'm sure it's the same Nicholas Farrington because it says a missionary, former poet. I nearly died. I knew him well, you know, in those days. I expect they'll hush it all up about those days if they want to make a martyr story." "How did it happen? Is it gruesome?" "Oh, I don't know. There's only a paragraph. You'll have to find out more through your grapevine. I'm shattered. I've got heaps to tell you." The Committee of Management wishes to express surprise at the members' protest regarding the wallpaper chosen for the drawing room. The committee wishes to point out that the members' residential fees do not meet the running expenses of the club. The committee regrets that the spirit of the May of Tech Foundation has apparently so far deteriorated that such a protest about the wallpaper has been made. The committee refers members to the terms of the club's foundation. Joanna Child was a daughter of a country rector. She had a good intelligence and strong, obscure emotions. She was training to be a teacher of elocution, and while attending a school of drama, already had pupils of her own. Joanna Child had been drawn to this profession by her good voice and love of poetry, which she loved rather as it might be assumed a cat loves birds. Poetry, especially the declamatory sort, excited and possessed her. She would pounce on the stuff, play with it quivering in her mind, and when she had got it by heart, she spoke it forth with devouring relish. Mostly she indulged the habit while giving elocution lessons at the club, where she was highly thought for it. The vibrations of Joanna's elocution voice from her room, or from the recreation room where she frequently rehearsed, were felt to add tone and style to the establishment when boyfriends called. Her taste in poetry became the accepted taste of the club. Thank you.
I'm the second Joe, the O'Neill one. I'm going to read from the beginning of The Driver's Seat, which is a fairly terrifying novel that Muriel Spark wrote. I suppose I too should say something about why I'm here. I'm here because I'm a reader of Muriel Spark's, and I read her books for the first time quite recently, actually. Only I would say, in fact, I can tell you when. In about 8 years ago, and it's one reason why I'm rather pleased that we're having this gathering on her anniversary, because I read her for artificial reasons, which is that I was asked to read her because I was asked to write something about her, and so I embarked upon a sort of, perusal of her novels out of a sense of professional obligation, and was quite astonished by this writer, particularly since at that point my sweet spot for literary appreciation had been gradually shrinking over the years, so that I was easily irritated by any sort of book, like an old golf club. You barely hit a ball anymore, and yet when I came across this work, I just devoured it with great admiration and happiness, and I feel like the thing that she does. That she does lots of things, obviously, but the remarkable thing from a writer's point of view is how she can write novels of 110 or 120 pages that feel richer and more voluminous than something that could be 5 times the length. And it's just extremely rare, if you scour the literary landscape, as it were, to find anyone who can do it. I don't think anyone else can do it. I certainly can't. Much as my irritation. I'd love to write a sort of immortal 120-page novel. So haven't done it yet. Anyway, so one of those is The Driver's Seat, which is this very strange and dark work, which I'm sure a lot of you know, and I'll read from the beginning. And the material doesn't stain, the salesgirl says. Doesn't stain? It's the new fabric, the salesgirl says. Specially treated, won't mark. If you spill like a bit of ice cream or a drop of coffee down the front of this dress, it won't hold the stain. The customer, a young woman, is suddenly tearing at the fastener at the neck, pulling at the zip of the dress. She is saying, "Get this thing off me at once." The salesgirl shouts at the customer, who up to now has been delighted with the bright-coloured dress. It is patterned with green and purple squares on a white background, with blue spots within the green squares, cyclamen spots within the purple. This dress has not been a successful line. Other dresses in the new stainless fabric have sold, but this, of which 3 others, identical but for sizes, hang in the back storeroom awaiting the drastic reductions of next week's sale, has been too vivid for most customers' taste. But the customer, who now steps speedily out of it, throwing it on the floor with utmost irritation, had almost smiled with satisfaction when she had tried it on. She had said, "That's my dress." The salesgirl had said that it needed taking up at the hem. All right, the customer had said, but I need it for tomorrow. We can't do it before Friday, I'm sorry, the salesgirl had said. Oh, I'll do it myself then, the customer had said, and turned round to admire it, sideways in the long mirror. It's a good fit. Lovely colours, she said. And it doesn't stain, the salesgirl had said, with her eye wandering to another unstainable and equally unsaleable summer dress, which evidently she hoped now to offer the satisfied customer. Doesn't stain? The customer has flung the dress aside. The salesgirl shouts, as if to assist her explanation, specially treated fabric. If you spill like a drop of sherry, you just wipe it off. Look, miss, you're tearing the neck. Do you think I spill things on my clothes? The customer shrieks. Do I look as if I don't eat properly? Miss, I only remarked on the fabric that when you tell me you're going abroad for your vacation, there is always the marks that you pick up on your journey. Don't treat our clothes like that, if you please, miss. Miss, I only said stain resisting, and then you carry on after you liked it. Who asked you for a stain resisting dress? The customer shouts, getting quickly with absolute purpose into her own blouse and skirt. You liked the colours, didn't you? Shouts the girl. What difference does it make? So it resists stains, if you like the fabric before you knew. The customer picks up her bag and goes to the door almost at a run, while two other salesgirls and two other customers gasp and gape. At the door, she turns to look back and says, with a look of satisfaction at her own dominance over the situation, with an undoubtable excuse, I won't be insulted. Excuse me. She walks along the broad street, scanning the windows for the dress she needs, the necessary dress. Her lips are slightly parted. She whose lips are usually pressed together with the daily disapprovals of the accountant's office where she has worked continually, except for the months of illness, since she was 18, that is to say, for 16 years and some months. Her lips, when she does not speak or eat, are normally pressed together like the ruled line of a balance sheet, marked straight with her old-fashioned lipstick, a final and judging mouth, a precision instrument, a detail warden of mouth. She has 5 girls under her and 2 men. Over her are 2 women and 5 men. Her immediate superior had given her the afternoon off in kindness, Friday afternoon. You've got your packing to do, Lisa. Go home. Pack and rest. She had resisted. I don't need a rest. I've got all this work to finish. Look, all this. The superior, a fat, small man, looked at her with frightened eyeglasses. Lisa smiled and bent her head over her desk. It can wait till you get back, said the man. And when she looked up at him, he showed courage and defiance in his rimless spectacles. Then she had begun to laugh hysterically. She finished laughing and started crying all in a flood, while a flurry at the other desks, the jerky backward movements of her little fat superior, conveyed to her that she had done again what she had not done for 5 years. As she ran to the lavatory, she shouted to the whole office, who somehow or other were trying to follow or help her. Leave me alone, it doesn't matter. What does it matter? Half an hour later, they said, you need a good holiday, Lisa. You need your vacation. I'm going to have it, she said. I'm going to have the time of my life. And she had looked at the 2 men and 5 girls under her and at the quivering superior, one by one, with her lips set straight as a line which could cancel them all out completely. Now, as she walks along the street after leaving the shop, her lips are slightly parted, as if to receive a secret flavor. In fact, her nostrils and eyes are a fragment more open than usual. Imperceptibly but thoroughly, they accompany her parted lips in one mission, the sensing of the dress that she must get. She swerves in her course at the door of a department store and enters. Resort department. She has seen the dress. A lemon yellow top with a skirt patterned in bright V's of orange, mauve, and blue. Is it made of that stain-resisting material? She asks when she's put it on and is looking at herself in the mirror. Stain-resisting? I don't know, madam. It's a washable cotton. But if I were you, I'd have it dry cleaned. It might shrink. Lisa laughs, and the girl says, I'm afraid we haven't anything really stain-resisting. I've never heard of anything like that. Lisa makes her mouth into a straight line. Then she says, I'll have it. Meanwhile, she's pulling off a hanger a summer coat with narrow stripes, red and white, with a white collar. Very quickly, she tries it on over the new dress. Of course, the two don't go well together, says the salesgirl. You'd have to see them separate. You'd have to see them on separate. Lisa does not appear to listen. She studies herself, this way and that in the mirror of the fitting room. She lets the coat hang open over the dress. Her lips part and her eyes narrow. She breathes for a moment as in a trance. The salesgirl says, You can't really see the coat at its best, madam, over that frock. Lisa appears suddenly to hear her, opening her dress and closing her lips. The girl is saying, You won't be able to wear them together, but it's a lovely coat over a plain dress, white or navy, or for the evenings. They go very well together, Lisa says. And taking off the coat, she hands it carefully to the girl. I'll have it, also the dress. I can take up the hem myself. She reaches for her blouse and skirt and says to the girl, Those colours of the dress and the coat are absolutely right for me. Very natural colours. The girl, placating, says, Oh, it's how you feel in things yourself, madam, isn't it? It's you's got to wear them. Lisa buttons her blouse disapprovingly. She follows the girl to the shop floor, pays the bill, waits for the change, and when the girl hands her first the change, then the large bag of heavy paper containing her new purchases, she opens the top of the bag, enough to enable her to peep inside, to put in her hand and tear a corner of the tissue paper which enfolds each garment. She's obviously making sure she's being handed the right garments. The girl is about to speak, probably to say, Everything all right? Or thank you, madam, goodbye. Or even don't worry, everything's there all right. But Lisa speaks first. She says, The colours go together perfectly. People here in the north are ignorant of colours. Conservative, old-fashioned. If only you knew. These colours are a natural blend for me, absolutely natural. She does not wait for a reply. She does not turn towards the lift. She turns instead towards the down escalator, purposefully making her way through a short lane of dresses that hang in their stands. She stops abruptly at the top of the escalator and looks back, then smiles, as if she sees and hears what she had expected. The salesgirl, thinking her customer is already on the escalator out of sight, out of hearing, has turned to another black-frocked salesgirl. All those colours together, she's saying, those incredible colours. She said they were perfectly natural. Natural? Here in the north, she said. Her voice stops as she sees that Lisa is looking and hearing. The girl affects to be fumbling with a dress on the rack and to be saying something else without changing her expression too noticeably. Lisa laughs aloud and descends the escalator. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jerry Howard. I really have to say that one of the things I love about New York is that you could get a pretty full house for an event like this. I think you can consider yourself among the elect. Anyway, I'm a book editor, and I want to thank the 92nd Street Y for this opportunity. As 98% of the time, I'm on the other side of this microphone, and I'm just very grateful. So I had the pleasure and the honor of being the editor for Muriel Spark's last two novels, Aiding and Abetting in 2001 and The Finishing School in 2004. I'm not entirely sure how this happy event came to pass. It was mostly, I guess, through the good offices of Muriel's agent, Georges Burchard. I met Muriel once at a dinner at the Burchards in New York with Penelope. Hello, Penelope. And she was formidable in person, and she was equally formidable in correspondence. I won't pretend to have done much or anything in the way of editing. Such suggestions that I had on The Finishing School to give it more of a Jean Brodie flair were swatted away with the imperial disdain they no doubt deserved. So I don't have a lot of firsthand stuff to tell you, but I have a really, what I think is a pretty good Muriel Spark anecdote to share that I received some years ago at secondhand. It came from my friend and sort of mentor when I worked at Viking, a man named Cork Smith, who was the best fiction editor I've ever known. So in 1961, Cork was a young editor at Lippincott, and they had just published to spectacular praise and very healthy sales The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Clark was not her editor then. He was later at Viking, but he was assigned the task of being her host and kind of minder when she came to New York to do publicity on the book. So, as Cork told it, he went to Muriel's her hotel and asked her if there were any local sites she wanted to see. The Statue of Liberty, maybe, or the Empire State Building. And Muriel immediately replied, "Yes, I want to view the remains of Mother Cabrini," which took Clark aback, as you can imagine. But Muriel Spark, in this wonderful phrase, had been received into the church, a couple of years before, and Mother Cabrini, who's the first American saint, had been canonized in 1946, and her earthly remains, or most of them, the details are pretty grisly, I refer to Wikipedia, were on display under glass in a shrine in Washington Heights, somewhere around 190th Street. So into a cab went Cork Smith, a Philadelphia WASP Episcopalian, and Muriel Spark, a Jewish convert, for the long trip north to what strikes me as a pretty strange and wonderfully piquant pilgrimage. I have a feeling Cork didn't go in to see the remains. Anyway, I'm going to read one short passage from The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie that I came upon the other night doing my homework. And it's so wonderfully well and fantastically well done that I can't not share it with you. I'm sure all of you have read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. Anyway, it is not to be supposed that Miss Brodie was unique at this point in her prime, or that, since such things are relative, she was in any way off her head. She was alone merely in that she taught at a school like Marcia Blaine's. There were legions of her kind during the 1930s, women from the age of 30 and upward who crowded their war-bereaved spinsterhood with voyages of discovery into new ideas and energetic practices in art or social welfare, education or religion. The progressive spinsters of Edinburgh did not teach in schools, especially in schools of traditional character, like Marcia Blaine's School for Girls. It was in this that Miss Brodie was, as the rest of the staff spinsterhood put it, a trifle out of place. But she was not out of place amongst her own kind, the vigorous daughters of dead or enfeebled merchants, of ministers of religion, university professors, doctors, big warehouse owners of the past, or the owners of fisheries, who had endowed these daughters with shrewd wits, high-colored cheeks, constitutions like horses, logical educations, hearty spirits, and private means. They could be seen leaning over the democratic counters of Edinburgh grocer's shops, arguing with the manager at 3 p.m. on every subject, from the authenticity of the scriptures to the question of what the word guaranteed on a jam jar really meant. They went to lectures, tried living on honey and nuts, took lessons in German, and then went walking in Germany. They bought caravans and went off with them into the hills among the lochs. They played the guitar, and they supported all the new little theater companies. They took lodgings in the slums, and distributing pots of paint, taught their neighbors the arts of simple interior decoration. They preached the inventions of Marie Stopes. They attended the meetings of the Oxford Group and put spiritualism to their hawk-eyed test. Some assisted in the Scottish nationalist movement. Others, like Miss Brodie, called themselves Europeans, and Edinburgh, a European capital, the city of Hume and Boswell. They were not, however, committee women. Now, that, folks, is writing. And I'm going to, it's writing. I'm going to read from the beginning of the novel, the first novel I published, Aiding and Abetting, which was published in 2001. And it's a nice exercise because you can get to gauge the change of style from, I guess, what you call early middle Spark to late Spark. And as you'll see, the style is so swift and economical and so much lighter than that. And all you need to know about the book is that it's a novelization, a fictionalization, I guess, of a real case of a man named Lord Lucan, who, as it happened, sort of accidentally murdered his maid and almost murdered his wife in 74, I think, and he took it on the lam and was never captured or actually seen again, and it was understood that this beastly upper class fellow was helped in his escape and exile by his other beastly upper class friends, and who were his aiders and abettors. So Lord Lucan, it begins. The receptionist looked tinier than ever as she showed the tall Englishman into the studio of Dr. Hildegard Wolfe, the psychiatrist who had come from Bavaria, then Prague, Dresden, Avila, Marseille, then London, and now settled in Paris. I have come to consult you, he said, because I have no peace of mind. 25 years ago, I sold my soul to the devil. The Englishman spoke in a very foreign French. Would you feel easier, she said, if we spoke in English? I am an English speaker of a sort since I was a student. Far easier, he said. Although, in a sense, it makes the reality more distressing. What I have to tell you is an English story. Dr. Wolfe's therapeutic methods had been perfected by herself. They had made her virtually the most successful psychiatrist in Paris, or at least the most sought after. At the same time, she was tentatively copied. Those who tried to do so generally failed. The method alone did not suffice. Her personality was needed as well. What she did, for the most part, was talk about herself throughout the first 3 sessions, turning only casually on the problems of her patients. Then gradually, in an offhand way, she would induce them to begin to discuss themselves. Some patients, angered, did not return after the first or at least second session conducted along these lines. Others remonstrated, "Don't you want to hear about my problem?" No, quite frankly, I don't very much. Many, fascinated, returned to her studio, and it was they who, so it was widely claimed, reaped their reward. By now, her method was famous and even studied in the universities, the Wolfe Method. I sold my soul to the devil. Once in my life, she said, I had a chance to do that, only I wasn't offered enough. Let me tell you about it. He had heard that she would do just this. The friend who had recommended her to him, a priest who had been through her hands during a troubled period, told him, she advised me not to try to pray. She advised me to shut up and listen. Read the Gospels, she said. Jesus is praying for you in sympathy. You have to see his point of view, what he had to put up with. Listen, don't talk, read the Bible, take it in. God is talking, not you. Her new patient sat still and listened, luxuriating in the expenditure of money, which he would have found impossible only 3 weeks ago. For 25 years, since he was struck down in England by a disaster, he had been a furtive fugitive, always precariously beholden to his friends, his many friends, but still playing the role of benefactors, their numbers diminishing. 3 weeks ago, his nickname Lucky had become a solidified fact. He was lucky. He had, in fact, discovered some money waiting for him on the death of one of his main aiders and abettors. It had been locked in a safe, waiting for him to turn up. He could afford to have a conscience. He could now consult at leisure one of the most expensive and most highly recommended psychiatrists in Paris. You have to listen to her. She makes you listen, first of all, they said, they being at least 4 people. He sat blissfully in his smart clothes and listened. He sat before her desk in a leather chair with arms. He lounged. It was strange how so many people of the past had been under the impression that he had already collected the money left for him in a special account. Even his benefactor's wife had not known about its existence. He might, in fact, have been anybody, but he arranged for the money to be handed over, but she arranged for the money to be handed over without a question. His name was Lucky, and lucky he was indeed. But money did not last. He gambled greatly. The windows of Dr. Wolfe's consulting room on the Boulevard Saint-Germain were double glazed to allow only a pleasing hum of traffic to penetrate. I don't know how it struck you, said Hildegard, Dr. Wolfe, to her patient, but to me, selling one's soul to the devil involves murder. Anything less is not worthy of the designation. You can sell your soul to a number of agents, let's face it, but to the devil, there has to be a killing or so involved. In my case, it was many years ago. I was treating a patient who became psychologically dependent on me. A young man, not very nice. His problem was a tendency to suicide. One was tempted to encourage him in his desire. He was simply nasty, simply cruel. His fortune was immense. I was offered a sum of money by his cousin, the next of kin, to slide this awful young man down the slope. But I didn't. I sensed the meanness of the cousin and doubted whether he would really have parted with the money once my patient was dead. So I refused. Perhaps, if I had been offered a substantially larger sum, I would have made that pact with the devil. Who knows? As it was, I said no. I wouldn't urge the awful young man to take his own life. In fact, I encouraged him to live. But to do otherwise would have definitely, I think, led to his death, and I would have been guilty of murder. Did he ever take his life then? No, he is alive today. The Englishman is looking at Hildegard in a penetrating way, as if to read her true thoughts. Perhaps he wondered if she was in fact trying to tell him that she doubted his story. He wanted to get away from her office now. He had paid for his first session on demand, a very stiff fee, as he reckoned, of $1,500 for 3/4 of an hour, but she talked on. He sat and listened, with the large bulging leather briefcase at his feet. For the rest of the period, she told him she had been living in Paris now for over 12 years and found it congenial to her way of life and work. She told him she had a great many friends in the fields of medicine, music, religion, and art, and although well into her 40s, it was just possible she might still marry. But I would never give up my profession, she said. I do so love it. His time was up, and she had not asked him a single question about himself. She took it for granted he would continue with her. She shook hands and told him to fix his next appointment with the receptionist, which in fact he did. It was towards the end of that month that Hildegard asked him her first question. "What can I do for you?" she said, as if he was positively intruding on her professional time. He gave her an arrogant look, sweeping her face. "First," he said, "I have to tell you that I'm wanted by the police on two counts, murder and attempted murder. I have been wanted for over 20 years. I am the missing Lord Lucan." Hildegard was almost jolted at this. She was currently treating another patient who claimed, convincingly, to be the long-missing Lord. She suspected collusion. "I suppose," said the man at present sitting in her office, "that you know my story." She did indeed know his story. She knew it as thoroughly as anyone could, except for the police, who naturally would have kept some secrets for herself. Hildegard had gathered books and obtained press cuttings dating from 1974, when the scandal had broken to the present day. It was a story that was forever cropping up. The man in front of her, aged about 65, looked very much like the latest police identikit of Lord Lucan, but so in a different way did the other patient. The man sitting in front of her had reached down for his briefcase. "The story is all there," he said, tapping the bulging bag. "Tell me about it," she said. He does. He finishes. The good Dr. Wolfe looked at her patient and let the above facts run through her head. Was this man sitting in front of her, the claimant to be Lord Lucan, in fact the missing murder suspect? He was smiling away at her thoughtfulness. And what did he have to smile about? She could ring Interpol, but had private reasons not to do so. She said, "There is another Lord Lucan in Paris at the moment. I wonder which one of you is the real one. Anyway, our time is up. I will be away tomorrow. Come on Friday. Another Lucan? I will see you on Friday." Thank you.
A reader of the recent New Yorker article about you says that you write from the point of view of God. What is your reaction to this thought?
Well, that would be a big claim. I don't know what the point of view of God is, but I write from a religious point of view because I believe in God. And I believe I have a religion. And I write not from the point of view of religion, but the religion as a point of departure, as a sort of compass point to measure from.
Someone asks, does writing come easily to you, or are there periods of difficulty and blockage?
Oh, no, it comes easily to me.
And would you care to say anything about what you're working on now, or your forthcoming projects?
Well, I'm writing a novel at the moment. I'd rather not talk too much about it. I usually solve all the problems of a novel before I start writing it. That if there's any research to be done, I do that first and read up the subjects that I don't, or go and see about them, or go to the country, or go somehow acquaint myself with what I'm writing about, and get the ideas, and then I write.
Here's a film-related question. Dear Miss Spark, do you think Maggie Smith's film performance captured your Jean Brodie?
I think it was a brilliant performance. It didn't capture my Jean Brodie because mine was, in the first place, it was in bright colours, and the colours in Edinburgh are, I'm talking about the film now, the colours in it are muted and rather silvery. The colours weren't right, I didn't think, but I got used to that. I thought her interpretation of Jean Brodie was extremely wonderful, awfully moving. It wasn't at all mine because, in fact, one writes for an audience, for an individual who has a book in his hand going to read that book maybe 1 or 2 evenings. Whereas a film and an actress who is interpreting a part has to get the whole magic over in 2.5 hours at the most. It's a totally different medium, so it can't possibly bear much resemblance to the original. No film can, but a lot of films do justice to a book or are better than a book as works of art in themselves.
Maybe another geographically related question. I think you've been living in Italy now for about 25 years or so.
Yes.
A question that might be asked is, born in Edinburgh, is there a particular reason that you've chosen to live and work for these 25 years in Italy?
Oh, it's a beautiful country, you know. As a matter of fact, it's only in the last few years it's becoming not so pleasant. There's a sort of revolution going on, and all sorts of things being uncovered. It's not very pleasant to live with it. But I think that I went there because I liked the churches, I liked the antiquity, I liked everything about Rome. Then I moved to the country, and I do like the Tuscans. They're awfully warm and generous people, and at the same time reserved.
Does Italy in any way feed your creative process more than any other place
Well,
that
it
you
does.
might?
Sorry, did you? Yes, it does. In that I get a lot of piece to write. No, I'm not sort of. My books are published there, but I'm not so well known, and people respect an artist very much. Well, I'm left alone to write, if I want to. I get much more peace than I would get anywhere else.